joining us. For those of you who have never been to one of our webinars before, or who don't know us, I just want to say a quick word about Democracy International. We are a German-based NGO, and we work on issues of direct democracy and citizen participation, transparent politics, basically anything that brings citizens into political decision-making. And our idea for tonight was that with the presidential elections a month behind us and the results clear, there is now enough mental capacity and mental bandwidth to have an in-depth look at many of the other wonderful things that that Americans voted on November 3rd. Because in 32 states in the US, people actually get a say on ballot initiatives, and citizens, in many states, citizens get to propose legislation that is then voted on by all. So we will have two panels tonight. The first one will focus on how direct democracy in the US works. Then afterwards, we will hear from three initiatives that were on the ballot this November. One last technical thing before we really get started. So we want to leave time for questions. Please hold on to them until after the discussion. We will have a panel discussion first, and then at the end, you're very welcome to ask your questions personally or in the chat. We will make sure that our panelists get them then. This also works if you're watching on YouTube. You can write your questions in the chat there. And just for now, all participants are automatically muted, but you can unmute yourself at any time. Of course, try to stay muted during the panel so that there are no disturbances. So then I would like to introduce our moderator of our first panel, Dane Waters, who really is a direct democracy expert, who's the founder of the Initiative and Referendum Institute at the University of Southern California. He's worked on presidential campaigns, on ballot campaigns, and he is also the founder of the Elephant Project. And most importantly, of course, he is a board member for Democracy International. So welcome, Dane. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. And just so you know that, I mean, for some people in the United States, the results are still not clear about the election results. I think somebody needs to like put what do they do in Germany where they put the note on the German door about whatever it was. We need to put a note on the White House door to say, hey, knock, knock, it's over with, you know. Anyway, enough of my humor here. So no, I think it's a good entrance into the discussion because as anybody in the United States or around the world knows that the election coverage has been consumed by Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And regardless of whether or not you're a Trump supporter or a Biden supporter, the reality is there's so much more going on or that went on in the United States. And it's not just what was on the ballot, it's the process to getting things on the ballot and what is happening to those things post being on the ballot. So I'm excited to have a wonderful panel today to talk about, the way the panel is going to go, honestly, is that we're going to talk about things that were on the ballot, the outcome, that we're going to talk about some of the specific issues associated with direct democracy in the United States at the state level. And then we're going to talk about, one thing that's been an ongoing trend in the United States, at least as far as I believe, the assault, quote unquote, on the initiative process and on initiatives. A little background on that is that, as was discussed, direct democracy is really available in some form in all 50 states, but only in a little over half of those states do people have the ability to actually put things on the ballot. But as we all can imagine, at least in the United States, that lawmakers see direct democracy as an affront to their power and authority. So they are doing more and more every election cycle to make the process more difficult to use by a combination. I guess I need to turn my phone off here. Sorry about that. A combination of trying to change the requirements and add additional restrictions, but as Oliver will talk about, it's also now about, trying to limit the issues themselves when they actually make the ballot. And that coupled with just the, extreme complications associated with COVID. So the way we will do this is that each panelist here, I will ask just to speak around 10 minutes to allow times for us to take questions. And so I'd like to start with Jackie Mitchell. Jackie, introduce yourself to the world and let's take it from there.
All right, yeah, hello. My name is Jackie Mitchell. I cover ballot measures at Ballotpedia. So I've been covering statewide ballot measures for about 3 years now. So yeah, I guess I'm just going to give a general overview of ballot measures in the US, go over kind of the process, how it works, some numbers, and then I'll talk a little bit about notable topics from the year. On November 3rd, voters in America did not just decide on who the next president would be. In the US, there are 26 states and Washington, D.C. That have an initiative or referendum process at the state level where citizens can collect signatures for a proposed law or a veto referendum to challenge a law that was passed by their state legislature or initiate a constitutional change. Additionally, in every state except Delaware, if a legislature amends their state constitution, that has to go on the ballot for voter approval or rejection as well. So on November, voters in 32 states decided 120 statewide ballot measures. Of those 120 measures, we've called 87 as approved and 31 defeated. The remaining 2 are too close to call until more ballots are counted and results are certified. So 40 of those 120 measures were initiated by citizens and 75 were referred to the ballot by state legislatures. And then 5 other measures were automatically placed on the ballot due to certain constitutional requirements or state law requirements. For example, there was a question on the ballot in Iowa about whether or not to hold a constitutional convention, and that has to go on the ballot periodically automatically. The types of measures that are allowed in the states that have an initiative process vary. So for example, Florida citizens can only initiate measures that amend the state constitution. And then, for example, in New Mexico and Maryland, citizens can only initiate veto referendums to challenge a law passed by their state legislature. So different types of initiatives available in different states. And then, of course, the initiatives are placed on the ballot for voter approval or rejection if enough signatures are collected in accordance with state law requirements. So that varies by state as well. So for example, in California, to amend the Constitution, initiative proponents have to collect over 997,000 valid signatures. And in contrast, the same type of measure in South Dakota only requires 26,900. So a lot of difference there as far as signature requirements by state. So if we look at all of the measures in 2020, not just at November, there were 129 in total. 120 were on the ballot on November 3rd. We also had 8 ballot measures that were decided at pre-November election dates. And then we also have one to be decided in Louisiana on December 5th. So that brings us to 129 total statewide ballot measures for 2020. And that is the lowest number of statewide measures that we have seen on the ballot since at least 1980. So in recent years, from 2010 through 2018, there was an average of 172 statewide measures on the ballot during even-numbered years. And so the 43 citizen-initiated measures this year was also low compared to recent years. From 2010 through 2018, there was an average of about 59 measures. So we also track how many initiatives were filed for the ballot. So in 2020, we tracked 881 initiatives that were filed targeting the 2020 ballot. And this is less than in 2018, where we saw 947 filed, and a little over 1,000 were filed in 2016. We know of at least 20 or so campaigns that had filed initiatives or were in the process of gathering signatures, but ended up suspending their signature drives due to coronavirus concerns. So that's a lot of numbers, and I'll focus a little bit more now on things that were actually voted on this year and some major topics. So major topics that we've seen this year were elections policy, taxes, and of course, marijuana. So there were 18 measures on the ballot in 14 states concerning elections policy, and those ranged different subtopics from campaign finance to election systems, redistricting, suffrage, term limits, and one of the most notable measures concerning elections was Proposition 113 in Colorado, and that was a veto referendum asking voters voters whether or not Colorado should join the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Voters did approve that referendum, and therefore Colorado was joined to that compact. And that, of course, goes into effect when enough states representing 270 electoral votes join that compact. And then tax policy is always huge. 19 measures were on the ballot in 12 states concerning tax-related policies. One of the most notable tax measures was Arizona Proposition 208. That was approved. It was designed to enact a 3.5% income tax in addition to the existing 4.5% income tax on incomes over $250,000 for individuals to fund teacher salaries in schools. And finally, marijuana is a popular topic for ballot measures. Voters in Arizona, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota approved recreational marijuana legalization. New Jersey voters were the first to approve recreational marijuana legalization through a legislatively referred ballot measure instead of a citizen initiative. So that's interesting. It's also interesting to see Arizona, Montana, and South Dakota approve recreational marijuana at the ballot because those states had voted for the Republican presidential candidate from 2000 to 2016. And then voters in South Dakota and Mississippi approved medical marijuana initiatives, and South Dakota was the first state to vote on both recreational and medical marijuana at the same election. We also saw some really unique measures this year that were the first of their kind, including Proposition 114 in Colorado to reintroduce gray wolves, and Oregon Measure 109 to create a psilocybin mushroom program. And I am really excited to hear from representatives of those campaigns later on in the panel. And so the last thing that I want to talk about is just some campaign finance numbers. This is really interesting to me. So committees registered to support and oppose the 129 statewide measures on the ballot in 2020 reported a combined total of $1.19 billion in contributions. And the 43 citizen initiated measures accounted for 78% of that. And this is interesting because almost the same amount of money was raised in 2018 to support or oppose the 167 statewide measures. So it's interesting to note that we saw $5 million more in contributions for 2020 ballot measures compared to 2018, despite having 40 fewer measures on the ballot this year. So a lot of money spent on ballot measures this year. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Jackie. I think that I'd like to hold the questions till the very end so we get an opportunity to get all the comments in from the panelists. And then I have actually a couple of questions for you at the end as well.
Okay,
so let's, great presentation. Thank you for that. Let's move on to John Matsusaka for his remarks. John, take it away.
Thank you, Dane. Let's make sure. Introduce ourselves. So I'm John Matsusaka. I'm a professor of business and law at the University of Southern California. I am also executive director of the Initiative and Referendum Institute that Dane founded a long time ago now, it seems. And so it's good to be here virtually. It's good to see so many people or see so many names that I hadn't run across in a long time. So that's fantastic. I was asked to make a couple just general comments on themes or general things that have come out of the election. And so I just picked a few things that I think are particularly interesting that might be maybe worth noting and can be launching pads for discussion. First of all, there are, as Jackie mentioned, we had a lot of marijuana related proposals across the country this year. These things have passed. I think there's only one measure that's really failed in the last decade or so. So this is a really interesting pattern that's continuing to be driven. It's really a policy, a rather dramatic policy change that's taking place across the country from the grassroots up. It's not being driven by any politicians. It's generally being opposed by sitting governments. And it's really interesting because it's part of it really is part of a very long-term trend that started really going back into the 1990s even, when marijuana proponents successfully tried to get states to adopt medical marijuana laws that allowed people to use marijuana for medical if they had medical conditions. And what we've seen is that over time, clearly as part of a general campaign, as those laws were passed and people got used to living with marijuana for medical purposes, they started to get used to the idea of having it around for other purposes as well. And so we've seen them continue to expand it out into purely recreational uses now, which are what most of the measures that we saw this year are about. I think we've got about 30% of the country now lives under a state that legalizes marijuana. This is continuing to spread. It's also there's also now talk at the federal level where the Democrats are discussing the idea now of voting on legalizing it at the federal level. We're also seeing it being pushed more at the state and local level because the underlying logic of marijuana legalization is a libertarian notion that people ought to be able to regulate what goes into their bodies as they want. And so we saw along those lines, we saw Oregon approve an initiative, two initiatives that were very interesting this November. One was to legalize the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms. That passed. And then there was another law that essentially decriminalized any sort of drug. So essentially legalized everything, heroin, cocaine, you name it. And so we're seeing that boundary continue to get pushed by initiatives. And I think that's one thing that's interesting to look at. Another thing that I wanted to flag was money. There's a lot of money that goes into a small number of initiatives. And that's something that always should be kept in mind. The 120 so propositions that have taken place this year, most of them didn't get a lot of money, but a few of them got an immense amount of money. The one that got the most attention, at least in this country in terms of money, was a proposition in California, which had to do with ride sharing. And more than $200 million was put into that campaign. Almost all of it was put by the pro side. In a very nutshell, what the origins of that measure was that the Democratic controlled legislature, under pressure from the unions largely, passed a law that tried to restrict the ability of rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft to employ their drivers as independent contractors. The companies believed or claimed that this would compromise their business model, so they put an initiative on the ballot to write their own law, interestingly enough, that would override that and would allow them to keep their drivers as rideshare workers and put all this money in, and it passed by a very large margin. There was also a huge amount of money spent in California on a measure having to do with kidney dialysis, regulation of kidney dialysis. And again, this is illustrating that often you'll see large sums of money when there's a very concentrated economic interest at stake. And that was, in that case, that was by dialysis companies we're trying to oppose an attempt to regulate them. And the other one I'll mention that put a lot of money in, because it illustrates another way that a lot of money can come into the system, was in Illinois, where the governor Pritzker, who is a very wealthy man on his own rights, put something like $60+ million into an attempt to amend the Illinois Constitution. He's a sitting governor as well, but he wanted to amend the Illinois Constitution so that it would be possible to impose a progressive income tax, because the state right now only allows a flat rate tax. To impose a progressive income tax, essentially in order to raise income taxes, and it was met by another wealthy individual who is in the finance industry, who put more than $50 million of his own money opposing it. And so the overall spending on this went easily over $100 million, basically coming from two people. So it's a huge amount of money just in one race. But we're seeing this from time to time where, because campaign contributions are essentially unregulated for ballot propositions, we can see huge amounts of money come in. The last thing I want to talk about, which is an interesting pattern, which Jackie alluded to, and let me just note two interesting cases. First of all, California at the federal level is a very blue state, and it voted for Joe Biden, the Democratic nominee for president, and it gave him his largest wedge. What's the word I'm looking for? Its largest margin, of any state in the country. At the same time that the voters went overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, they also voted down a whole bunch of proposals that the Democrats had put on the ballot to them, and they actually were not necessarily conservative, but certainly they rejected progressive proposals. They rejected a proposal that would have allowed the state to reinstitute racial preferences on college admissions and hiring, otherwise called a particular form of affirmative action. They rejected a proposal that would have allowed local governments to control rents beyond what the state already does. They rejected a proposal that would have allowed taxes, higher taxes to be imposed on property taxes to be imposed on corporations, and they rejected the rideshare and they accepted the rideshare proposal that overrode the Democratic law, the law sponsored by Democrats that I just talked about. So again, you had a state that went Democrat at the presidential level, but then rejected Democratic proposals across the board and ballot propositions. On the other side of the story, exactly the same thing, but in reverse, Florida is a state that gave its electoral votes to Donald Trump. So by a not immense margin, but it wasn't razor thin either. The state went red and voted for Donald Trump in the presidential election. But it also approved a Democratic or progressive backed proposal to increase the minimum wage in that state as well. So these are two interesting examples where we see that voters will go one way, say for president, but they'll vote in ways and for policies that the person they voted for opposes. In fact, when it comes to ballot propositions. So this is really interesting. Some people suggest that the voters are maybe irrational, because how can you vote for a candidate and then reject that candidate's proposals? But it's not really that they're irrational. It's that voters just think about politics a different way than elites think about politics. And in particular, we know from quite a bit of political science research that politicians hold beliefs about issues in very tightly packaged bundles. And what I mean by that is that for a politician, at least in the US, if you know that politician's position on one issue, like abortion, you can predict with a great deal of confidence what that politician's position will be on a whole bunch of other issues like gun control, healthcare, and environment. So this is called ideology. And again, politicians, generally speaking, hold very tightly packed bundles of issues. Voters, we know from a lot of political science research as well, voters do not organize the world in those same tight bundles. Voters will pick and choose across issues. So for voters, it's not a contradiction to them. They might support Black Lives Matters, but at the same time, they might oppose use of racial preferences or affirmative action programs to advance those same goals. So there's many examples like this where voters will take a policy that might seem like a Democrat or progressive policy, and they might also hold what seems like a conservative or Republican policy at the same time. What happens is that when we do representative democracy, we force voters to pick one of the tightly constricted bundles that the political elites hold. Essentially, in the US, you have to either buy the Democratic bundle or you have to buy the Republican bundle when it comes down to candidate elections. You don't get to pick and choose between these two things. And I'm bringing this up because this is one of the very important things about direct democracy and ballot propositions in general, is that it allows voters to unbundle issues. They don't have to just buy them in the combinations and packages that the major parties propose them. And this has a number of important benefits to democracy in general. First of all, it allows policies to be brought into tighter alignment with what voters actually want. Voters can actually choose on an issue by issue basis and bring policies into alignment. So they can get some Democratic policies and they can get some Republican policies. They don't have to go all in on one or the other. It also allows voters to force compromise. They don't have to they don't have to buy kind of the extreme polarized positions that the parties have moved into right now. The voters have the option to choose middle policies. And there's finally a really subtle benefit, not really, but there is a subtle benefit that's sometimes not recognized, is that it also allows voters to have representatives that they like better. And the best way to illustrate that is just think about a typical state. Suppose it's a Democratic controlled state like California right now, where the governor and the legislature are Democrats. If the voters decide that they don't like a particular policy, they don't like a particular tax policy, for example, that's currently held by the Democrats. If they want to change that tax policy, they have to kick out the Democrats and put the Republicans in. There's no other way. There's no other way to go forward. They have to. And what the problem with that is they might like, say, the Democratic governor. They might like the Democratic governor on a whole bunch of other issues, but disagree with the governor on a particular tax issue. What what happens when you have ballot propositions out there is that voters can keep the elected officials they like, but override them on other particular issues. So it also allows voters not to have to make a very unpleasant choice of maybe having to kick out an official who's otherwise skilled and talented in order to get their way on a certain issue. So that's a general benefit, and partly I'm mentioning that a bit because I'm plugging a little bit a book that I just wrote that just came out a couple months ago, which is trying to explore these arguments, and in particular the fact that we can't do this. This is all very good, and it's all very good for states, but as most of you know here, I'm sure, is that we can't do this at all at the national level in the United States. There is no provision for ballot propositions at all at the federal level. And this is very unfortunate. It makes the United States, first of all, out of step with the rest of the world. Most other democracies in the world now do hold national votes from time to time on issues. The US is one of a vanishingly small number of countries that has never asked its citizens to vote on a national issue ever. And so what do I mean by that when I'm talking about other countries? Like Brexit is the obvious example, which I'm sure will come to many of your minds, which is a vote on European integration, a very controversial vote in 2016. But it's also one thing that people sometimes don't recognize about Brexit is that this was very controversial and the outcome was unusual, but it's very common for European nations to vote on that. And many of you are in European nations, so I don't need to tell you that, but just for those who aren't, there have been more than 50 votes on European integration since the 1970s across the countries of the region. So voting on European integration is an entirely normal, ordinary exercise of democracy. So the United States, again, is a huge outlier in terms of it has never taken a national vote on an issue. It's unfortunate because most Americans say they want to vote on national issues. We have survey after survey. The most recent one I saw was Pew Research Center did a survey, found that by a 2-to-1 margin, Americans say they do want to vote on important national issues. And I mention that because sometimes people say that Americans don't want to vote on issues. Well, that's simply not true. Americans do want to vote on issues based on every poll that we have. And Americans have been voting on issues for more than 200 years at the state and local level. So they know how to do this, and they seem to have done it just fine. So there's no reason to think that Americans uniquely amongst the democratic citizens of the world are incapable of voting on issues. They're perfectly capable. So this could actually be done very easily. This is the last thing I want to say because I don't want to leave time for discussion, but I want to just throw a couple of these thoughts out there for discussion later on. It would actually be very easy in principle for people in the United States to vote on issues. Where things get a little bit confused is when people talk about direct democracy, it's often become identified with the initiative process. And the initiative process is one important form of direct democracy. And doing that at the federal level would be extremely difficult, require a constitutional amendment. I can't really see any path that could happen for the foreseeable future. So if you're talking about that kind of direct democracy in the US, you can't do it. At least you can't do it now. But it would be very easy for Congress to call an advisory vote of the citizens and ask people, what do you guys think about an issue before you? For example, Congress could simply pass a law saying we're going to hold an election next November and we're going to ask people what they think on an immigration issue. Do you want to build a wall? Or do you want to provide a path to citizenship for people who are currently in the country illegally? Congress could simply by an act of Congress, doesn't take a constitutional amendment, could call for a national vote. It'd be an advisory vote. And that's really what a lot of other countries do anyway. It's the sitting government calls a vote on an issue. It figures that it's a good idea to allow the citizens to weigh in on this issue, but the outcome isn't binding. It's just like Brexit, in fact. So the usefulness of this would be, it would allow the Americans to break out of the ideological bundles that they're forced into right now. Right now, they have to either buy the Republican package or the Democratic package. We know on the ground that Americans are deeply frustrated with the way the federal government is working, and part of the frustration is they really aren't given choices. They're really being asked to choose between two kind of extreme polarized camps, and they're not comfortable with either of those. So I'll just throw that out there as a thought because I think it comes out of looking at how people vote in the states, where they actually do choose between the extremes. They want some progressive and some conservative things, if you want to use those words. And it really does suggest that having those things available at the national level might be useful for the same reasons. So thanks, Dane.
Thanks, John. It's definitely a lot of questions to come out of that. That bears the question, in a country of 350 million people, do two political parties truly represent, what the wishes of the people are? But as a side note, when you talk about mushrooms, I just want to say that there was an article in the New York Times talking about a bumper crop of mushrooms in Ukraine. So I don't know if there's any relationship there, probably not, but if you want mushrooms, Ukraine's the place to come. I'm sure it's not the same type of mushrooms, but I thought I'd throw that out there. So hey, let's move on to Mr. Paul Jacob, who's my evil twin, who happens to be 20 years older than I am, even though he looks 30 years older than I am. So Paul, where are you? There you are up there. He actually dressed up for the panel, so I want you guys to know he put a nice sweater on. So go ahead, Paul.
Well, thank you, Dane. My name is Paul Jacob, and I'm president of Citizens in Charge and Citizens in Charge Foundation. Citizens in Charge is an advocacy group. We lobby. We try to get people on the right and left together to push for reforms of initiative and referendum to make it more accessible, or more often, unfortunately, we try to block legislatures from ripping up the process in one nice way or another. This year, there were 3 measures on statewide ballots to undercut the initiative process. There was issue 3 in Arkansas, there was amendment 4 in Florida, and there was measure 2 in North Dakota. And these measures were a little bit different. Florida and North Dakota were similar, but all 3 measures were predicated by their supporters on the need to stop big outside money from having so much influence in the initiative process. The interesting thing to me was that all 3 measures did absolutely nothing to have any impact on money whatsoever, except to make the process so much more difficult that it would require a lot more spending. Now, if you could somehow raise the process to where it was so expensive that even big, powerful special interests with lots of money couldn't use it, well, then maybe that would make some sense, except that it would destroy the process for everybody. Instead, what tends to happen is, and this is true not just with these ballot measures, but with other laws that are passed that create all kinds of hurdles, red tape in the process, it's almost always predicated on stopping powerful, wealthy special interests. But by raising the bar financially, it tends to create more and more an initiative process that doesn't stop big, powerful special interests. It stops the grassroots, who can't afford to jump those hurdles, can't afford to hire the professionals to deal with all the different ins and outs of the process that become very complicated. So these 3 measures, I'll take them in reverse order. North Dakota passed a measure, and originally when it was introduced, it required that after a constitutional amendment was passed, and this would be true not only for initiated constitutional amendments, but for other constitutional amendments, those proposed by the legislature. But once it was passed by the voters, it would come back to the legislature, and would then the legislature could approve or reject it. And I should correct myself. In North Dakota, this is not true. It would only affect initiated constitutional amendments, not those proposed by the legislature. When I get to Florida, you'll see it's a little different. But they then amended that because there was such opposition to that concept that somehow the legislature could basically veto the people they work for, that they changed it so that it would now come back to the legislature, and if they vetoed it, meaning a majority of the legislators did not approve it, it would go to a second vote. Now, that's much better because the people are still in charge and make the ultimate decision. But you can see that if you have a lot of money, that second election would not be that big a deal if the legislature said no. If you were, a grassroots group that was scraping by to be able to even get on the ballot, that second election could be one in which you were swamped by, special interests who didn't like your initiative. So that was defeated by the public, 55-45. And we were helped very much. My group, Citizens in Charge, got involved in doing some Facebook ads and other activities and worked with a coalition there. But we were very much helped by former Governor Schaefer coming out and saying this is a bad idea and making the critical point that the whole point of the initiative process is for citizens to check the legislature, not so much for legislators to check the citizens. And interestingly enough, the impetus for this effort to go after the initiative process, not that it was the first in North Dakota, but the impetus was an initiative that passed in 2018 that created an ethics commission, some regulation of campaign finance and governmental elected official ethics that the legislators did not like at all. And you could imagine, well, why wouldn't they just put that up for a revote instead of trying to wreck the initiative process? Because they knew they couldn't win a new vote, is why I think they didn't do that. In Florida, Amendment 4 is similar. It required a second vote to pass a constitutional amendment, and it applied to all constitutional amendments in Florida, not just the initiated ones. Florida already requires a 60% vote to pass a constitutional amendment. This would have required a second 60% vote. And this was very unusual because it came through the initiative process, not from the legislature. And the funding of it is somewhat unclear. An organization gave the money, but it's not clear where they got that money. My suspicion is that it came from people who were fighting an anti-fossil fuels measure, and they were looking for ways to block that in the future. So raise the bar that much higher. Of course, the problem is, as I already stated, the more you raise the bar that much higher, you don't raise it high enough to stop big special interests, but you stop that grassroots efforts. And those are really the whole point of this process, is to have that ability for anyone to come check the powers that be. The third measure was issue 3 in Arkansas. And this one was designed to make some changes that I think most folks who read about those changes, and the ballot title in Arkansas told people almost nothing. So if they didn't know anything about the measure when they walked into the ballot box, they didn't know anything when they pulled the lever. We worked, again, Citizens Charge worked with some other organizations in Arkansas against both issue 2 and 3. We brought a 12-foot tall carved wooden horse into the state and took it around from city to city and got a good amount of press. Issue 2 was one that weakened term limits, which are already weak enough there that most of the term limit supporters, myself included, hardly cared whether it was issue 2 or whether it passed or not. But we wanted to wrap together what the legislature was doing, which was trying to weaken their already weak term limits and trying to block any chance for citizens to come back with a real term limit proposal. And just as by way of further introduction, I got my start in initiative and referendum by working for term limits. And that's really what woke me up to the fact that you have to have some way for citizens to combat the conflict of interest that elected officials have, where they're voting on their own pay, their own perks and privileges, and their own power in a sense. And so there has to be a way that citizens can block that, can check that, and the initiative process is that way. Well, we were unable to defeat issue 2, but we were able to defeat issue 3, which is great because now term limit supporters and others can come back. But there were a couple of things that I think were interesting to note about issue 3 in Arkansas. One is that Tom Cotton, who had no Democratic opponent, only had a Republican or a Libertarian opponent, won his Senate race by 67%. He did op-eds, he did mail pieces that featured his mug and him saying, vote for issue 3. He won with 67% of the vote. And yet his endorsement, which was somewhat disconcerting for those of us on the other side, because we knew how popular he was, did not seem to make that much difference. Issue 3 went down with 56% of the people saying no. So, and more people voted for US Senate than on the initiative, but not that many more. So it's pretty clear that at least about a third of his supporters voted against his very vocal endorsement of issue 3. Again, showing that someone can like you as the US Senator and want you to be US Senator, but not necessarily follow what you think is right on an issue by issue basis. And so, you know, that I think was one thing that I picked up out of that effort. The other thing I think is that the more money was spent on the yes side on that particular measure. In the other 2 states, there was very little money spent on either side. In Florida, no money to speak of spent on either side after it was on the ballot. In North Dakota, we spent a little bit. I think we spent about $10,000, which in the grand scheme of things is not a whole lot, as I'm sure you realize. But in Arkansas, there was more money spent, more spent on the yes side. But the critical thing in all of these cases is that there was no grassroots support coming for these measures. These measures were supported by the legislatures. In Florida's case, by an individual or several individuals that people didn't know. But the media, the news media, the grassroots was overwhelmingly against all 3 of these measures. And as long as they knew something about them, we were likely to prevail as we did.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. I mean, it actually goes to the point that Matsusaka was making about the unbundling, how, you know, people like to pick and choose on the issues versus just following blindly the political parties. And just so I just want everyone to know also that the only reason I know about the initiative process is because Paul Jacob once hired me. If it hadn't been for Paul, I would not be here today, and I would not know about direct democracy being from Alabama. So thank you, Paul, for that. Or some people may curse you for that, who knows, but I want to say thank you for that. So our final panelist, and I tell you, there's never enough time in these panels, it doesn't seem like. Oliver Hall. Oliver, the distinguished Mr. Hall, take it away, sir.
Thank you, Dane. My name is Oliver Hall. I'm founder and legal counsel of Center for Competitive Democracy. Our mission is to strengthen American democracy by eliminating barriers to participation and increasing electoral competition. And so consistent with that mission, much of what we do is ballot access litigation on behalf of candidates and voters seeking to participate in the electoral process outside the Republican and Democratic parties. And because that work is very closely intertwined with some of the issues that are raised with the initiative process, and also because I think it provides some useful context to the legal issues that are raised by the initiative process, I wanted to quickly go over a few cases involving candidate ballot access from 2020, and then shift to the initiative process and talk about some of those cases. And I'm gonna cover quite a few cases in this very short time, so I'll keep it very brief on each case, mostly focusing on outcomes, whether they were successful or not, and then drill down on what I take to be the key legal issue facing those of us who support the initiative process going forward. So in the candidate ballot access context, the legal standard is relatively settled, certainly as compared to the legal standard that applies in cases challenging the constitutionality of statutes regulating the initiative process. And just to boil it down to the most simple statement that I can, the standard is essentially that if we bring a case on behalf of candidates and voters and political parties, and we are able to demonstrate that the burden on their constitutional rights is severe, then we're likely to win the case and the law will be declared unconstitutional. If the burden is found to be less than severe, and certainly if the burden is found only to be minimal, very much less likely to win that case, and the law is much more likely to be upheld. With that standard in mind, let me just turn to a few what we consider to be good outcomes from the 2020 election. And the first is some states, Vermont, for example, and also the District of Columbia, took the initiative themselves to address the COVID pandemic and by legislatively. And so Vermont, for example, just eliminated their signature requirement altogether. Parties, unlike the Republicans and Democrats that are unable to, that don't have ballot access automatically, the way they get on the ballot is by submitting nomination petitions signed by a specified number of voters. And of course, that becomes very difficult, if not impossible, during a pandemic. And so some states took the initiative, again, Vermont and the District of Columbia, to either eliminate or just substantially reduce the signature requirements that applied in 2020. So that was a good outcome. Another, maybe probably the best litigation outcome that we had in 2020 was in federal court in Illinois. We brought a case there on behalf of the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, several minor party and independent candidates. And what is really a great judgment, the court there reduced the statutory signature requirements by 90%, extended the filing deadlines for submitting the nomination petitions, eliminated notarization requirements, and allowed electronic petitioning, which is a point I want to come back to, electronic petitioning. And the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed that result. Another good outcome came out of Maryland. We filed a case there on behalf of the Green Party of Maryland, the Libertarians, and affiliated voters and candidates. In that case, the signature requirement was reduced by 50%, and again, electronic petitioning was allowed. And in these states where Illinois and Maryland, they did not previously allow electronic petitioning. So that was really kind of a dramatic change on the fly as far as election procedures go. There was a case in Massachusetts from the state Supreme Court there that also reduced signature requirements by 50%, extended filing deadlines, and also allowed electronic petitioning. So those were all good outcomes from our perspective. Let me throw out at least one bad outcome because I got to keep it honest here. And there were certainly a lot of bad outcomes. We filed a case in Pennsylvania on behalf of the Libertarians and the Greens and affiliated voters and candidates. And in this case, the court dismissed the case, found no severe burden on the plaintiff's rights, even though by the governor's executive order, it was legally prohibited to petition, to go outside of your house for the purpose of collecting signatures, because the governor's executive order, as in many states, said, don't leave your house except for life essential activities, and petitioning for ballot access is not one of those. And yet, in spite of that 75-day legal prohibition on collecting signatures, the court found no severe burden on the plaintiff's constitutional rights, and the Third Circuit pretty summarily affirmed that result. So that just gives you a sense of, I mean, the Pennsylvania case and the Illinois case, or for that matter, any of the cases I just cited, essentially arise from the same facts. Of course, signature requirements and other ballot access requirements vary pretty widely in different states, but all of these cases were precipitated by the fact that we're in a pandemic, that it's both unsafe and in many, if not most cases, in fact, illegal to attempt to comply with these ballot access requirements. And yet you found courts who were unwilling to grant any relief whatsoever, or even to find a severe burden on plaintiffs' rights. And the irony was not lost on us that these decisions were entered by courts that were closed to the public, issued by judges that were sitting either in chambers or at home because it was unsafe for attorneys and plaintiffs and other parties to be in the court at that time. So, and yet there is the wide set of outcomes that we had, even in the candidate context where the legal standard is relatively well settled. Turning to the initiative side, it was also a mixed bag, but certainly I think more bad than good compared to the candidate side. And one key difference, I think, is that unlike the candidate side, there is no clear standard for determining the constitutionality of statutes regulating ballot access for initiatives. At least there's no clear national standard, although different federal circuit courts of appeals apply different standards. And let me just turn to that so that I can explain that a little more clearly. Even before the COVID pandemic arose, the federal courts of appeals were split over the central issue of whether the Constitution protects the right to place an initiative on the ballot. So there are some circuits, and each circuit is responsible for the district courts in a specified number of states. So for example, the Ninth Circuit and the Sixth Circuit courts of appeals are among those circuits that hold that the First Amendment does protect the right to put an initiative on the ballot. And so when cases are brought in those states belonging to those circuits, challenging the constitutionality of a statute limiting citizens' ability to put an initiative on the ballot, the courts there say, okay, the Constitution affords some protection. Now let's see if this statute actually violates the Constitution. In sharp contrast to that, there is a separate set of circuits that holds that placing an initiative on the ballot is not a federal right at all. It's not protected by the federal Constitution. It is a state-created right, and therefore the federal Constitution does not apply in these cases, or it applies only in limited circumstances. And so circuits that hold this view are the Seventh Circuit, for example, and the Eighth Circuit, the DC Circuit, and I think the 10th Circuit. And so what these courts hold is that unless the statute limiting the ability to put an initiative on the ballot directly limits political speech, or directly limits a person's right to go out and collect signatures, then the First Amendment simply isn't implicated and there is no constitutional protection. Well, if you're thinking like I do, that distinction is sort of hard to make sense of, I think there's a lot of people that agree with us on that, because ultimately any statute that limits your ability to put an initiative on the ballot ultimately limits your ability to engage in core political speech. That, although it's not the only thing you're trying to do when you're trying to put an initiative on the ballot, I would argue that it is inherently political speech. It's hard to imagine something more politically expressive than the effort of a concerted group of citizens who are joining together to try to place a ballot measure on a state's ballot. So when you read these cases that make this distinction between statutes that supposedly infringe on First Amendment rights and those that don't implicate it at all, I think it's very difficult to maintain that distinction in a kind of a comprehensible way. So all of these issues came together, I think, in a trio of cases that was decided by the Sixth Circuit in the 2020 the 2020 election cycle. And the first one is called Ashaki v. Whitmer. That was a candidate ballot access case. These are candidates of the Republican and Democratic Party seeking access to the primary ballot. And of course, they alleged, like all the plaintiffs in these COVID cases, that the pandemic was making it unsafe and difficult, if not impossible, to collect the signatures they needed to get on the primary ballot. In this case, the district court found a severe burden on their rights. It entered an injunction against the enforcement of the signature requirements, and granted other relief, what the Court of Appeals subsequently characterized as rewriting the election code in an improper way. Nonetheless, despite the Sixth Circuit's objection to that, the remedy aspect of the district court's decision, the Sixth Circuit did affirm the injunction, the prohibition against the state enforcing these signature requirements in the context of a pandemic, and the Sixth Circuit here did find a severe burden. In the next case, Sawari Media v. Whitmer, also coming out of Michigan, Ashaki v. Whitmer was out of Michigan as well. This was an initiative case. Proponents of a criminal justice reform initiative sought relief from the signature requirements they had to comply with, again alleging that the pandemic made it unsafe and difficult, if not impossible, to comply. And the district court once again found a severe burden and enjoined enforcement of the signature requirement. And once again, the Sixth Circuit affirmed. The Sixth Circuit here said, notwithstanding the difference between this initiative case and Ashaki, which was a candidate case, the Sixth Circuit said, look, the burden here is exactly the same. These initiative proponents are operating under the same executive order that imposed a severe burden in Ashaki. And for that reason, the burden here is unconstitutional as applied to initiative proponents. Now remember, the Sixth Circuit is one of those circuits that finds that the Constitution does apply in these cases, as opposed to the other side of the circuit split, where it only applies if certain conditions are met. So the third Sixth Circuit case I wanted to mention was one that we brought, led by my colleague Mark Brown, who's a professor at Capital University in Columbus, and also a member of our board of advisors. This was an initiative case brought on behalf of proponents of a cannabis decriminalization initiative. And once again, they sought relief from the signature requirements they had to comply with based on the difficulties imposed by the pandemic. The district court in this case found a severe burden, enjoined enforcement of the signature requirements, and granted some other relief, but really sent it back to the parties, the plaintiffs and the defendants, to hash it out and try to figure out a way to go forward that would protect the plaintiffs' rights while also accommodating the state's need to maintain an orderly election and the integrity of the ballot. Well, the defendants, the state, took an emergency appeal, and in this case, the Sixth Circuit granted a stay of the injunction, in other words, said that the district court injunction could not be enforced. And then here, the Sixth Circuit said the burden's not severe, at most it's intermediate, and therefore the state interests are sufficient to justify the burdens that are imposed on the plaintiff's rights. So I know that was a very cursory explanation. I hope it was sufficient for everybody to follow along and to consider what is the key difference between these three cases, Ashaki, Sawari Media, and Thompson. Well, according to the Sixth Circuit, one key difference was that the governor's orders imposing the lockdowns in Michigan Ohio's stay-at-home order imposed by the governor of Ohio included an exception for First Amendment protected activity, whereas the order from the Michigan governor in Ashaki and Sawari Media contained no such exception. And so based on this distinction, largely, the Sixth Circuit found that the Ohio order and the Ohio statutes did not impose a severe burden because nobody was prohibited from going out and getting their signatures, whereas in Michigan, they were actually prohibited from doing so. Again, I think there's some difficulty with this distinction. One is that the so-called First Amendment exception in the Ohio order did not actually exist at the time we filed the case, but was only added to subsequent orders after the litigation commenced in what we thought was pretty clearly a litigation tactic. And then also, notwithstanding this First Amendment exception, supposed exception in Ohio, it was still prohibited by the governor's order to do things like have parades, put on theater productions, hold large public gatherings for purposes of supporting political issues. All of these things are clearly First Amendment protected activity, and yet they were prohibited. So the supposed exception for First Amendment activity, I think, didn't even hold up internally within Ohio. But that was what the Sixth Circuit relied on largely. Okay, so obviously there are a lot of issues to sort out here in this initiative context. And not surprisingly, the Supreme Court has taken notice. In an initiative case that came out of Idaho in the 2020 election, Reclaim Idaho v. Little, this arose from an initiative in which the proponents were seeking to put a tax initiative on the ballot to benefit schools. And they sought relief from the requirements, the signature requirements that they were subject to, and they alleged that the pandemic severely burdened their issues. Here, the district court effectively found a severe burden. There was a slightly different test that applied, but in essence found a severe burden on the plaintiff's rights, enjoined enforcement of the signature requirements, and essentially ordered the state either put this initiative on the ballot or extend the deadline and allow these initiative proponents to use electronic petitioning. The state defendants appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And while that appeal was pending, the defendants rushed to the Supreme Court, even though their appeal had not yet been heard, much less decided, and asked for an emergency stay from the Supreme Court of the United States. This is an unusual practice, and it's unusual for the Supreme Court to grant this kind of stay when an appeal is pending and has not even been heard. And yet in this case, the Supreme Court granted the stay, enjoined, stayed enforcement of the district court's injunction, and said explicitly in doing so, at least Chief Justice Roberts' concurring opinion in the case said explicitly, there is a circuit split about whether and to what extent the First Amendment and the Constitution protects the rights implicated in this case. That is the right to put an initiative on a state's ballot. And because we're reasonably likely to grant certiorari, in other words, accept a case for the purposes of resolving that split, we're going to go ahead and stay the injunction in this case. So where does that leave us? I think for anyone who's interested in expanding the legal rights that protect the initiative process, the prognosis is maybe not great at this moment. The fact that the Supreme Court was willing to issue that stay in Reclaim Idaho is not reason for optimism. And so when the court says something like, we're reasonably likely to grant certiorari to resolve this split, that's as explicit as the Supreme Court gets in terms of inviting lower court parties to bring their case to the Supreme Court so that they can finally litigate this issue, the extent to which the First Amendment and the Constitution protects the state initiative process. And so you have to wonder, is the Supreme Court likely to grant cert in one of these cases and then rule against those of us who are seeking to expand the protections for the initiative process? Dane, I don't know if I have another minute. I wanted to end on a note of optimism, but it's not essential. I can leave it there if we need to.
Well, I appreciate it. I wish I could give you another minute. I mean, that's the thing with these panels, that there's so much information to get across and get out there that, and I appreciate it. But I'd like to, since we're going into the time of the other panels, I'd like to be respectful of them, and I appreciate your time. So I'm not actually going to ask any questions, which is shocking to people, I'm sure. So Caroline, I'm going to turn it over to you to moderate and then to take it from here. So thanks.
Yes, and thank you, Dane, for moderating this panel. And thank you to all of the panelists for these great inputs. There's a lot of information there. And I've seen that there were some questions in the chat already. I think Joe Matthews, you were the first one to ask a question at the very beginning. So if you want to, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it live. I don't hear Joe. Okay, then I will, Arjen had posted 2 questions in the chat, so maybe Arjen, please go ahead.
Yeah, one question was already a bit answered by Bruno in the chat, but my second question is there is empirical research on Swiss referendums showing that the representativeness for the whole population is very high, and that's irrespective of whether the referendum had a high turnout or low turnout. Is that also true for the USA? And with the representativeness, I mean that in how far the referendum outcome is the same as the opinion of the whole population as measured through opinion polls.
You know, that has been my experience when I've heard different people, and I can't cite the study, but there have been some studies in the past about, 60% turnout or whatever the turnout is. Does that reflect the other 40% or does it not? And from what I've seen, it does reflect the other percent. And I'm sure on any given issue, it's going to fluctuate. But I think for the most part, those who are not voting tend to have the same breakdown as the population that is voting.
That's very interesting. You have references or?
I don't. I remember hearing a study, but that would have been probably 20 years ago or more. So I don't really have much to offer you other than that's the sense I have from what I've seen and read. But somebody with might want to look at the actual research.
Yeah, would you, John Matsusaka, know more about this?
I would defer to John because I'll bet he's read more of the actual research.
Yeah, my impression is the same as what Paul just said. I don't think I'm not aware of a study exactly on your question, which is sort of how does representativeness vary with turnout on ballot propositions. That it's actually really hard to measure representativeness for a variety of reasons. If you just want to go in statistically, this is actually a tricky problem that people are trying to do. So I'm not aware of anybody doing this specifically for ballot propositions, but my impression is similar to Paul's, though, that if you look at voters and non-voters, anecdotally, it seems like they're obviously different types of people vote than others, but it doesn't look like it's dramatically different from the point of view of ballot proposition outcomes. Obviously, if it's a super close election, then it is going to matter. But if you're talking about some sort of average, that's the best I can say, which isn't a great answer, I guess.
Yeah, we have a different political scientist who is also with us, Matt Forshaw from the UK, who would like to add something to that answer. So please go ahead, Matt.
Yes, so hello everyone. It's great to see so many old and new friends tonight. Just on the question, as I understand the question is, basically, do the non-voters have the same preferences as those who do vote? And we have some evidence from European referendum, which is my area of expertise, that non-voters have a rather different point of view and tend to be much more skeptical. There is a famous example of a British politician in this country who said that he would want turnout in the Brexit referendum to be low, and quote, the working classes to stay down at the pub where they belong, because they would have views that are very different from that. In the European referendums, there's often been the case that the higher the turnout, the more conservative with small c the outcome. So there tend to be more liberal outcomes if you have a low turnout, because typically those who turn out all the time are people who have for a number of reasons, liberal preferences. But if turnout goes up, you tend to have support for things such as Brexit, anti-immigration measures, and so on. go up. So we do have some evidence. There's an article from Political Quarterly from 2016, for example, that goes into some of the statistics about that.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I will take one more question, but then we really do have to move on because we have three wonderful panelists who are waiting in the in the green room, let's say. So Daniela Boshinova, you raised your hand, sorry. So please go ahead and ask your question. I believe it's on the voter compact. Daniela? Oh, you are still on mute, Daniela.
Okay, yes, I got unmuted. Okay, I'm very interesting inputs, especially the legal cases in court. The pandemic, I didn't know anything about that, and it was really very informative. But about the interstate popular vote compact, where you mentioned Colorado that they joined, they voted to join. How viable do you think this compact is? Because it's not new. It has been there for a number of years. And now I can't remember the exact number of states that have joined, but it was like less than 20, maybe 19. Is it a viable way to challenge the way the president is being elected, the electoral college and everything that is already plaguing the 21st century voters and electoral ways of the United States?
So as of currently, 15 states and Washington, D.C. Adopted legislation to join the compact. Together, they represent 196 electoral college votes. For that compact to go into effect, states representing at least 270 electoral votes would need to adopt that legislation. So I can't really comment on how viable it is, but those are the numbers.
Yeah, I was expecting a more, how to say, expert or personal comment on what your opinion of the compact is, if anyone shares.
Could I offer one? I think it's certainly viable. As Jackie just noted, we just need more states to get on board with the plan. And look, in 2016, we had presidential elections where the candidate who received fewer votes from the population won the election due to the Electoral College. The National Popular Vote Plan is a way to remedy that without requiring a constitutional amendment. It simply says that once all these states get together and amount to at least 270 votes in the Electoral College, their votes automatically will be pledged to the winner of the popular vote. That's as simple as that, and it can work. And look, I mean, you've already got a very good start toward that outcome, but you don't have any political will in Washington and beyond to push it over the edge. Where is the Democratic Party, which has twice fallen victim to this anti-democratic electoral college in the last 2 decades? Why are they not pushing for this reform? Instead, they're looking at all the wrong reasons why they lose elections or why their candidate wins more votes and yet isn't installed in the White House. And they ought to be seriously getting behind this. That's my opinion, which I think is what you asked for.
Yes.
Well, I would just add that I think conceptually, this idea has a lot of support getting rid of the Electoral College. But because it's cut against Democrats twice and for Republicans, it's become much more partisanized. And I think it's much tougher to get to that 270 votes because Republican states, years ago after the Gore loss, you didn't have Republicans, I think, as committed to the Electoral College as they are today. So I think it's a tougher road to hoe now. But it's the kind of thing that I think if you asked everybody in a vacuum, you'd have majority support for it.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists, Oliver, Jackie, Paul, John, and thank you to Dane for moderating this very, very interesting panel. There's so much to discuss. There's a lot being discussed in the chat, but for our second part of the evening, we thought it would actually be really nice to hear from some of the initiatives that were on the ballot on November 3rd. So as we've heard from Jackie, in 32 states, people got to vote on 120 ballot measures, and that's just the state level. So we have tonight with us representatives from 3 campaigns that were successful, and they are also 3 people who have had long careers in politics and a lot of experience with ballot initiative campaigns. So I'm very excited to hear from them. And they are really perfectly positioned to give us an inside view of a ballot initiative campaign. So I would like to welcome now Sam Chapman, who's a campaign manager for Yes on 109 in Oregon, which was the initiative to legalize psilocybin, I hope I'm saying that right, psilocybin therapy, which is the active compound in mushrooms. We are also joined by Ben Pallara, who is a senior strategist on Florida for a Fair Wage, an initiative to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And finally, we're joined by Rick Ritter, the lead consultant for the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund, calling for the reintroduction of the gray wolf in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. So in a first round of inputs, we're going to do this a little bit the same way as a previous panel. We will hear from the panelists, and then afterwards we will have some time for questions. So in first round of inputs, I would like to ask each of you to tell us a little bit more about your initiative, about what your goal was, the factors that have contributed to your success, and challenges that you've had to overcome. And so I would like to hand the floor to Sam Chapman of Yes on 109. Welcome, Sam.
All right, thanks, Caroline. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Sam Chapman. I use he, him pronouns. I was the campaign manager for Measure 109, also known as the psilocybin therapy measure here in Oregon. So where to start? I guess we'll start with the one thing that has affected everyone, which is the pandemic. So here in Oregon, we actually have the highest rates of we have the worst mental health crisis in the country, and that was prior to COVID. Now that we've been with the pandemic for some time, the CDC is actually saying that 1 in 3 Americans are suffering from some type of clinical symptom of depression or anxiety. And so really, there's not a better time to start advancing new options for healthcare for folks where current options may be falling short, right? We don't necessarily think psilocybin therapy is for everyone, but with 1 in 3 people experiencing some type of symptom of depression or anxiety, new options are very much needed. And so, this campaign was very timely in that sense. We've had research on psilocybin on the books for over 40 years on the safety and the efficacy of psilocybin from institutions such as Johns Hopkins, UCLA, NYU, the Imperial College of London, et cetera, all showing that psilocybin shows real promise for people who are suffering from depression, anxiety, and even addiction. And so we certainly would not be here if it weren't for all of the clinical trials and research that are going on right now. For those who are not familiar, the Food and Drug Administration has actually granted psilocybin therapy a breakthrough designation for both major depressive disorder and treatment-resistant depression. And so what does that mean? That means that the federal government that also considers, ironically, psilocybin a Schedule I, says that psilocybin, potentially shows promise above and beyond any current alternatives for people who are suffering from depression. And then we very much expect other conditions to be added to that as well. And so here in Oregon, with the mental health crisis that we have, Measure 109 creates a new option by adding psilocybin therapy to the tool belt for mental health illnesses. And so here in Oregon, obviously we have an initiative process. We were able to collect 160,000 signatures in order to make the ballot. And I'm sure I'll talk a little bit more about what that was like in a pandemic in a little bit, but we were able to make the ballot. And a little bit to our surprise as well, we got 56% in favor of psilocybin therapy. And so, there's a lot of reasons as to why that is, but I think education was key. right? The average voter did not know what psilocybin was. And so we saw that when we were able to effectively communicate what psilocybin was, what the studies were showing, what our measure did, and sometimes more importantly, what it did not do, and who stands to benefit from having access. Terminally ill cancer patients dealing with end-of-life anxiety, right? People that are being disproportionately affected by COVID, people that are suffering from depression, anxiety, et cetera. We all know someone who falls into one of those categories. And so we made it, we humanized the aspect a lot more. And I think that's what resulted in such a good turnout in favor of Measure 109. And so I'll stop there and save some of the nitty gritty of the initiative process for further questions.
Wonderful, great, and thank you for joining us. Yes, then I would like to introduce Ben Pollara, who is the senior strategist on Florida for a fair wage, and you have succeeded actually in passing a $15 minimum wage in the state, despite the fact that it's quite difficult in Florida because it's a constitutional amendment, so you need to get 60%. Yeah, so Ben, thank you for joining, and please tell us a little bit about yourself and about your initiative.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So my name is Ben Pollara, and I'm a Democratic political strategist based out of Miami, Florida, and I managed the campaign to pass Amendment 2 in the last election, which was an initiative that would amend Florida's constitution to raise the minimum wage next September to $10 an hour, and then $1 a year every September thereafter until it reaches $15 an hour. And we were successful and passed with as Caroline mentioned, 61% over just over that 60% threshold that constitutional amendments need to pass here in Florida. This is the third constitutional amendment initiative that I have run in the state of Florida. It's the fourth or fifth that I've been involved with. It is probably one of the last constitutional amendment initiatives, if not the last, that Florida voters will see in some time as a result of legislation passed by the Florida legislature and signed by the governor over the last two legislative sessions that have made what was already a very restrictive ballot initiative process that required a lot of signature gathering, legal review, and obviously that 60% threshold, which is the laws passed have made that exponentially more difficult, more expensive, a process that was already quite difficult, quite expensive. In addition, Florida has gone over the past, over the past 2-3 decades to almost complete Republican right-wing hegemony in our state capital in Tallahassee. Until relatively recently, the one kind of stopgap to that kind of right-wing power center was the Florida Supreme Court, which held on to a 4-3, moderate progressive majority until 2 years ago when a handful of justices were forced out because justices have to retire at a certain age. So there was three that were mandated retirement. Ron DeSantis, our Republican governor, got to appoint those three, and that too has killed a number of ballot initiatives in their tracks. This court has rejected so far an initiative that would deregulate, rejected even putting on the ballot an initiative that would deregulate the power industry here in Florida. It's rejected an initiative that would legalize marijuana. I think they're on the precipice of rejecting another initiative to legalize marijuana. There was two before the court, and then I was involved with an initiative that would ban assault weapons in the state of Florida, and that was summarily rejected a few months ago as well. The court is currently examining initiatives on, as I said, legalizing marijuana and also expanding Medicaid. I expect both of those to be rejected by the court. And again, this initiative to raise the minimum wage will probably be one of the last citizen initiatives that Florida voters have the opportunity to vote on.
Oh, that is very, very confronting to hear. Yeah, there's some sad news, and I hope we will talk more about that later.
Sure.
But first, let me introduce Rick Ridder, who is lead consultant for the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund, who succeeded in passing the reintroduction of the gray wolf in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, and who's also worked on a lot of ballot initiatives in the past. So please welcome Rick.
Oh, thank you very much. The Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund, a restoration of wolves project, was started about 4 or 5 years ago. Wolves were once prevalent in the state of Colorado, but were eradicated by ranchers and hunters by the mid-1940s. The effort to restore wolves began in some part as a result of the success of wolf repopulation in Wyoming and Yellowstone National Park, and Montana, Idaho, Washington, and to some extent Oregon. And the fundamental belief was that wolves would improve the ecological elements of the Colorado sort of western lands. The proposal that we put forth that to the voters after a signature gathering phase last fall. So we avoided some of the problems that other initiatives had with the pandemic. We collected 200,000 signatures during from pretty much June to December of last year, put it on the ballot, and the language called for reintroduction of the gray wolf to Western Colorado prior to 2023. The fundamental messaging piece of the campaign was restore the balance. We knew from our polling that a great many voters knew a fair amount about the Yellowstone experience and the benefits that wolves had brought to the Yellowstone Basin from an ecological standpoint. So that was the beginning of our messaging frame. What we did, and it was important, is that we communicated extensively using sort of classic Colorado Western myths. Our spokespeople were ranchers, in part because the ranch community was opposed. We decided to use ranchers ourselves, talking about the importance of restoring the balance. We used fishermen, hunters, again, to counter the opposition. And the messaging was very in tune with sort of classic American mythology, which is that ranchers had a good idea of what was good for the environment, that fishermen understood what was good for streams and rivers, and therefore wolves would benefit streams and rivers and the ecology, and that all Coloradans would benefit. Obviously, we had to, one of the reasons we use these myth makers, if you will, is precisely because we were going up against the classic myths of wolves being dangerous, that they were, you know, the big bad wolf, the Little Red Riding Hood syndrome, that, you know, voters still believe. And so what we had to do was turn that on its head by using sort of other standard symbols of the American West. And the final thing that we really had going for us, and we were outspent 2-1 in the end, is that we used obviously animals. And one of the things that a number of the Democratic campaigns learned in their digital activity was that if they started with animals, they found that they had a longer viewer rate, if you will, that instead of clicking off after 2 seconds, they'd click off after 3 to 5 seconds. So that some of the political campaigns that had nothing to do with animals were leading off their videos and their tweets with pictures of animals just to capture the attention. Well, we didn't have to worry about that because our candidate, in effect, was a wolf. And so we had a real advantage of that. And we, our communications were very much about restoring the balance by bringing back wolves to Colorado.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, and as I mentioned, all three initiatives that we have here today were successful, so they passed. Yeah, and I wanted to ask all three of you something. Why is it that you decided to do a ballot initiative campaign? In our previous panel, we spoke a little bit on politics in America, and of course that you have these sort of bundling of issues either in the Democratic Party or in the Republican Party, and that there are certain issues that just sort of fall out of the boat. And that initiatives sort of give voters this possibility to correct. And so I wanted to hear if that is also your perspective, if this is something that you've noticed, and if this is has played into your decision to run a ballot initiative instead of lobbying Congress, for example.
Well, I'll just answer for myself. Let's begin with the basic notion that ballot initiatives don't have spouses. And so that, fundamentally that this is a much better way to operate in the electoral system. But, 30 years ago, I was asked to do a ballot initiative to stop the spring bear hunt in Colorado. And so I guess I've been associated, our firm has, with animal rights, if you will, or activity, as well as conservation measures. But I don't think that, I do a tremendous number of ballot initiatives. I do a number of political candidates. But I think that the big question becomes, always, is there the desire among the voters for the type of change that people might seek? I mean, I can't tell you how many people come to us with all sorts of ideas to run a ballot initiative, most of which we inform them it's not just a particularly good idea. So I think that, what we do is we pick those on our own personal beliefs as well as, the viability of the issue.
Yeah, I want to echo one thing that Rick said there, I think that I completely agree with, which is that the ballot measure process is a true representation of what the people are ready for and what they want. In theory, that's the legislative process. In reality, we all know it's the exact opposite. It's those who have power and money get to see what they want for the most time. And every once in a while, enough people will compile enough money to get something done in the legislature. Speaking for Measure 109 and Oregon in general, we have a long history of being extremely proud and taking advantage of our ballot measure process, whether it be with death with dignity here in Oregon, whether it be same-sex marriage, and over the past 10 years or so, and I guess even more than 10 years, several decades, progressive drug policy reform. Oregon has always been one of the leading states to take one of the first steps in whichever direction the wind is blowing, luckily in a progressive manner for us. And so, here in Oregon, not only do we make history several times by putting these ballots or putting these measures on the ballot during a pandemic, but we created the first ever psilocybin therapy program and decriminalized small possession of all drugs simultaneously. in Oregon. So, really excited to kind of be leading the way and on the drug policy front here in Oregon. And I think it just goes to show that, this is a trend that, maybe has been popular in Oregon for a while, but if you look at national polling as well, people are tired of putting people in jail for drugs. We can't afford it. It's, the disproportionate impact is massive. And I really think that the ballot measure process is really one of the only ways in which we get that kind of trajectory and that type of acceleration, specifically within drug policy. I'm sure that's probably true in other areas, but the power and the lobby of law enforcement and people who are prohibitionists in general is much more powerful in the legislature than it is in the ballot measure process. And so we're excited to continue to utilize those facts here in Oregon to continue to push the envelope, specifically in terms of drug policy reform.
Thank you. Ben, I don't know if you would like to add something to that. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, mostly echo, I think what the previous two speakers said in terms of, in terms of the ballot initiative process being an alternative to legislators that often represent the people that have given them the money to put them in office, not those that have given them the votes to put them in office. And that is certainly the case in a state like Florida, where where single party domination has led to gerrymandering and really, most of the people in our state legislature are very right wing, despite the state being a pretty well divided down the middle state, and B, they don't really have to run for re-election because of how how partisan gerrymandering has worked in the state. So they are literally beholden only to to ideological and corporate interests, and so the ballot initiative process in Florida has really been the only way to achieve any sort of real progressive or any sort of real policy change over the last couple decades, and we've done it repeatedly. We passed fair districts amendments in 2010. We passed a huge funding of water and land conservation in 2014. We passed medical marijuana, which I did in 2016. The felons rights restoration, voting rights restoration, we did in 2018, and then of course minimum wage in 2020. But really, it has been these are policies that are antithetical to the people that are running Tallahassee, but these are also policies that have required 60% of the vote to pass. So they're obviously appealing to the voters of Florida.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you very much. We can't organize anything these days without addressing the elephant in the room. We have to talk about COVID, unfortunately. So during the first panel, we heard a little bit about how ballot measure campaigns have suffered because of COVID rules. And so I was wondering what your experience with this was. So obviously you've managed, whatever challenges there were, you've managed to overcome them. But from your perspective, especially given that you've organized other ballot campaigns before, was this more difficult? Was this different? How did you handle this?
I mean, from my perspective, I think we won with 61% of the vote. Needing 60, so it was about 100,000 votes separated us from defeat. And I think, frankly, COVID probably played a big part in our victory for two reasons. Number one, I think it put on display who were truly, who our hourly workers were in the state of Florida. It wasn't just kids or fast food workers. It was essential workers, right? It was the people that were stocking the shelves of the grocery stores, going to work, without proper PPE every single day, while the vast majority of us were, sitting in our homes, ordering delivery. And so I think that was, that was certainly a boon to our campaign messaging, and really made people think about what a minimum wage was and who received it. But then the other side of it was that Unfortunately, the pandemic devastated our economy here, and our economy is hugely driven by tourism and the service industry. And so, that had the unintended effect of basically bleeding dry our potential opposition. Usually it would be, in another year, I would have expected millions and millions of dollars of paid opposition from Disney, the Chamber of Commerce, the Hotel Restaurant Lodging Association. But, all these companies were frankly, taking a bath financially and laying off or furloughing, tens of thousands of employees. And so even, if they were to step up and make a big donation, which none of them did, it would have been a horrible PR look for them. But it was, certainly unlike any other, this was not the only campaign I did. I did some candidate campaigns, and certainly campaigning in 2020 was unlike any other time that I've done it.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I mean, I don't think there's no playbook. There's no pandemic playbook for any of us, right? So we all had to reinvent our own strategies. And I think, to the question, did it help or hurt? For Oregon, it was both. And it hurt more up front during our signature collection phase. So here in Oregon, we have to collect a certain percentage of registered voters, which ended up being a little over 120,000 valid signatures, which meant that the equation means that we actually need to collect 160,000 signatures for margin of error, which we were able to do. But when the pandemic struck, we had collected about 95,000 of our signatures. So we were only a little over halfway there. And here in Oregon, there's several laws that made the final 50,000 signatures to collect extremely hard to do. There's no online, you sign ballot initiative process here in Oregon. What there is a process where people can print out at home a single electronic sheet, sign it, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, put the correct address on it, and then mail it back to us. And I highlight those very dry but important points because you would not believe how many people skip one of those 6 points in the process and then we never get their signature, right? So not only that, but it was incredibly expensive. There's a second law here in Oregon that passed a couple of years ago that requires, if you're going to mail someone a sheet, which is the other option, people can download it, print it, sign it, or we can mail them a sheet that they can send back to us, which also allows us to provide a BRM envelope. So it's got everything on it. All they have to do is toss it in there, send it back. But that's not cheap. Here in Oregon, if you're going to mail someone a signature sheet, you have to include the entire text of the measure. Our measure is 71 pages. So we had to spend an extra $250,000 to mail a bunch of people signature sheets. And now luckily we were able to do it. Luckily one of our financial sponsors happens to be in the soap business, which is not a bad business to be in these days, Dr. Bronner's. And we were lucky to do that, but it was not without serious challenges and complete unknowns. No one had ever had to do that before. So that was on the front end and the hurdles that we really faced. And on the back end, and I think this is something that Ben said as well, which is that COVID provided a narrative, especially for our campaign, that we would have never been able to utilize to the extent that we did with COVID, right? COVID produces the mental health illnesses that psilocybin is very well positioned to help treat, right? So we got very lucky in that sense. And it really helped us identify and put the narrative up front. We all know someone who is suffering from anxiety and depression, and we were able to talk about that. So combined with the facts and the science with the emotional heartstring narrative, that was really a combination that luckily for us, played out very well in times of COVID. I still think we would have won had we not been in the middle of a pandemic, but I don't think we would have won as big as we did. And that's a result of, right place, right time, unfortunate pandemic. It happened to help us push the narrative on the other end. Rick, you're muted.
Rick, we can't hear you. Sorry, you're on mute. Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that. I would argue for our ballot initiative, the the virus was generally a complete negative for three reasons. The first and foremost was the negative message that the opposition was able to put forth, which is, look, this initiative could cost up to $10 million over the next 8 years. Isn't there something more important for us to put that money towards, particularly given that state budget is being slashed left and right? You know, that's $10 million that could go to education, healthcare, what have you. Two, that in terms of our fundraising, it absolutely hurt our small donor fundraising. We had a list of 60,000 people that we had built up over the last 5-6 years. And we found that when the virus hit, our contributions just dropped. People didn't quite have the money, and that and at the same time they were giving to national candidates, and that hurt. And the third thing that it did was it made it very difficult for our sort of broad base of support from conservation organizations. We had 69 different conservation organizations support us, all of whom, you know, originally signed up to do door-to-door and very public activities. That became impossible. And so part of our communication program was short-circuited because of the pandemic. About the only advantage I can think of was that the opposition had a similar problem with the sort of door-to-door or at least public communication issue.
Thank you all for these great inputs. I have more questions, and but I think many people have questions, so I'm going to open the floor now for questions from the audience. I see Daniela Fancic has raised her hand, so please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to all the panelists also from the first panel and now. It's really interesting to see also the on the ground work. I myself am from Michigan, but I also work with Democracy International here in Germany. My question is actually about a ballot initiative in 2018, but it came with some consequences and pushback that could be troubling for all initiatives in the future. So in 2018, in the midterm elections, Florida voted to restore the voting rights of felons or people with felony convictions as soon as they have finished their sentence in prison and finished their probation. So before the amendment, that meant that if you went to prison in Florida, if you had a felony or conviction, you lost your right to vote, even once you're out of prison. And because of this, 10% of the voting age population was totally disenfranchised. That was about 1.5 million people. But the amendment did pass in 2018 to restore these voting rights, which of course is really great. But a few months after the amendment was implemented, the legislature in Florida passed a law to clarify the amendment and basically add that felons would not only have to finish their prison sentence and their probation, but they would also have to pay all of their financial penalties. So that basically meant that out of these 1.5 million felons who just got their right to vote back, almost 800,000 of them just lost that again because of debt. So the question is, how do we make sure that the results of the votes are upheld without legislatures trying to be sneaky and finding these kinds of pushback loopholes that basically make the entire amendment ineffective? Like what would happen, for example, in Oregon if they say, okay, now we have a mandate to legalize the I can't say the word, but the magic mushrooms because of the people voted for it, but the legislature then says, okay, we will implement it into law that the mushrooms can only be used like on Wednesdays, you know. So I'm just wondering what is the way around this?
So I mean, this is, you mentioned the Felons Voting Rights Restoration Initiative in 2018, but the Florida legislature has acted repeatedly to obviate, the will of the voters when it comes to these ballot initiatives. And I think there's only the legislatures are there to pass laws. They can pass whatever laws they want, whether or not they are constitutional. It is the role of hopefully independent judiciary to arbitrate these things and make sure that the will of the voters wills out. But then the other part is on us who are mounting these campaigns, at least in the states that allow the proponents of the campaigns to write their own initiative language, which I know not all states do, but to do for us to do so as clearly and accurately as we possibly can, and I think that ultimately results in initiatives more likely to pass if they're written more to voters, but also ones that are more difficult to be circumvented by legislators. And when they are circumvented by legislators, to be more easily interpreted by courts.
Yeah, one of the things that we built into our measure here in Oregon that speaks to this is a 2-year implementation timeline. So nothing happens here in Oregon for 2 years. No licenses will be given until at least 2023. And we included that for several reasons, but one of which is because we've had an overly reactive legislature in the past to drug policy, specifically for adult use cannabis legalization. The legislature came in right away and essentially overhauled the entire program. Some of that was for good cause, other of it not so much. And so, really looking around the corner and kind of taking the wind out of their sails to say, hey, look, we understand this is a new thing. You might have questions, concerns, et cetera. We want to bring you into the process so you do not have a knee-jerk reaction that has consequences for the next decade to come, right? So we actually built that into our measure up front, and I think it paid off, not only with decision makers and elected officials, but with the general public too. When we're doing something new that might be a little scary and people want to, take their time, then time is what we're going to give them. So that was one of the tactics that we used with Measure 109.
And one that we used, by the way, with Amendment 2, with our, I think we were one of the first states to, I think the first state to pass by voter referendum a $15 minimum wage, but it's a $15 minimum wage that doesn't take effect until 2026. It goes from today at $8.56 to next September at $10, and then 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. But in our polling, and obviously we ultimately prevailed in the election, but in our polling, that kind of gradual phase in certainly made it more attractive to voters and tougher for our opposition to argue against.
I mean, with the wolf situation, we do fear some significant tinkering by the legislature, but also by the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Division, which is not enthusiastic about wolf reintroduction because it means more work. Sorry. We have some. We are fearful that there will be those that want to amend the initiative, and because it's statutory, the legislature can, in fact, do that. However, they would have to get the signature of the governor, and the governor is a strong proponent of wolf reintroduction. But I think we all face with a number of our initiatives the difficulty of maintaining the intent of the initiative as the voters sought through the legislative process, and in addition, the regulatory process, because that's where the real damage could be done. And going back to marijuana legalization in Colorado, there was real efforts on the regulatory effort and to curtail some of the mandates that the voters put forth in passing marijuana legalization.
Thank you. I saw that Donald posted a question in the chat. I'm just going to go ahead and read that one. So his question is on the first past the post voting system, simple majority system that exists in the US and in the UK. He says that it causes votes to go to waste, basically, and he's asking if you know of any movements that want to change that method of counting or of counting the votes, or if there are any initiatives for gerrymandering, against gerrymandering, or the redrawing of constituency boundaries. Sorry. Don't know if anybody wants to take that.
Well, I mean, I think the first past the post is just the I guess whoever gets the plurality wins. I assume that's what he's referring to. I mean, Florida had an initiative that was rejected by voters this past fall. Although rejected, 56% of Floridians supported it. That would have created not a ranked primary system, but everybody, all the Democrats, Republicans on the same primary ballot, and then kind of like Georgia, if somebody doesn't get 50%, then they would go to the November ballot. But that was rejected by voters. I think I mentioned earlier, we did pass some anti-gerrymandering measures that have been debatable effectiveness and only effective at all because of litigation and because of favorable federal courts. But certainly both those things are things that have kind of gathered some steam in the U.S. ballot initiative process over the last few years. I mean, California passed anti-gerrymandering measures as well, and some other states have done so legislatively in addition to the ballot initiatives.
Yeah, and as Daniela mentioned, there was an initiative in Michigan in 2018 that was successful in instituting, I believe they have a citizen jury drawing the districts now, right, Daniela?
Yeah, exactly. I think they're a jury of 7 or 9 citizens. So about 3 would be self-identified Democrats, 3 or so self-identified Republicans, and the rest would be politically neutral, and they would be randomly selected. You could also apply to be on the jury, and they're the ones now, this commission of citizens who will be redrawing the districts in Michigan.
There's a similar initiative that was passed here in Colorado, whereby there is a citizens committee that is drawing the district, and the citizens committee cannot include anybody. Citizen committee cannot include anyone who has worked or been employed or volunteered even for a political campaign for the last 5 years. So it'll be very interesting to see precisely who is on this committee and their level of expertise. In fact, what it does is it once again places it on the administrators as opposed to, shall we say, experts.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think we have time for one last short question. I see Chris has his hand raised, so you can go ahead and just ask your question.
Sure. My name's Chris Peebles. I've been active in California politics for about 50 years. You keep talking about citizen participation. That doesn't exist in California. The last initiative in California that was put on by voluntarily collected signatures was the Fair Political Practice Act in 1974. Now it's entirely money. If you are right wing, you go to Nielsen Merksimer, they write your proposition. If you're left wing, you go to the Remshow firm. Then you hire one of the companies that's funding this organization, and they collect signatures. And then, then it goes to the political consultants. And for example, Lyft and Uber spent $200 million so they could continue to use slave labor. It's a system, at least in California, that should no longer exist. It's entirely a creature of people with money.
So I guess as a question we could attach to that, is this a challenge that that you have seen in your states? Is there maybe, or maybe even more general, what are some of the challenges that you see, and maybe some of the good things in the system in your home states? And I think we can try and keep it short, and that will be then the closing question.
Yeah, I mean, Chris brings up a good point that even though the citizen initiative process is arguably more representative than a legislative process to a large degree, it still can be influenced by money, right? We live in a capitalist system, whether you like it or not, and that's how politics work. At the end of the day, you know, I don't think it's as straight up as there's just two different firms, right, left, that you have to go to, right? There are a lot of citizen-led initiatives that are backed by larger entities, right? And I think that, you know, especially in California, we're going to see some progressive drug policy reform efforts that are citizen-led in 2022 on top of legislative efforts. And, you know, of course, the people that are bankrolling those often have interests, but specifically in drug policy reform, we're seeing a lot of organizations that are doing this for racial and social justice. They're not doing it because they're going to make a buck. They're doing it because it's on the right side of history and prohibition has failed. And so even though those companies and those organizations and those nonprofits very often, sure, they have a motive and there's money behind it, that's a necessary part of the equation for it to happen. And so I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities, but also challenges that come with that, as Chris pointed out, is regarding to where the money comes from and why is it being given in the first place.
Yeah. Well, and you know, this isn't new either. This use of money and paid petitioners in Arkansas, my home state, when they got the process in 1911, they also put in the constitutional amendment protections for being able to pay circulators to go get the signatures, because people have so much time in their lives and they need, you know, the two things are time and money. And if you don't have one, sometimes you can give the other. So the other thing is, the better part about this process when it comes to money is that you can't corrupt an initiative. Now, the intent of somebody may be corrupt. They may think this is a terrible thing, I'm going to sneak it in on somebody, but they have to write it in black and white. And so that's just a tremendous protection. Again, we want to be on guard, but it seems to me this is a much better in terms of how money affects the process than when it comes to candidates where the money can be corrupting and where you're never quite sure what you're going to get.
Yeah.
You know, I would add that in Colorado, we've had in the last decade or so, 3 or 4 ballot initiatives that have made the ballot strictly with the use of volunteers. Now, in many cases, they went on to lose as better funded opposition came forward. But it is, I would say every year there's at least one ballot initiative that is on the ballot that was placed there 100% with volunteers. So I think there is still fundamentally the notion of citizen activism and capability. The long-term element is, if you don't have the money to communicate about it, it does make it a lot more difficult subsequently once on the ballot.
You know, I think one of the big failings is the official failing in terms of communication. A number of states have no ballot pamphlet, no official information going out whatsoever. And the media, frankly, does not cover these ballot measures in any way of significance. And that's a big problem.
Thank you, Paul. Ben, I don't know if you want to share the perspective from Florida on that.
I mean, Florida is, is similarly positioned as California in that it has become, it has become such that there is truly no such thing as a citizen initiative because the signature requirements are are so great, and the time limits are so tight that in the absence of hiring a small army of petition circulators, there is simply no chance you're going to get on the ballot. But like some others mentioned, there have been some citizen initiated initiatives that have ultimately gotten funding from folks to put them over the finish line. The Felons Rights Restoration Amendment is an example of that. That was originated and written by a former felon, this guy Desmond Meade, and ultimately ACLU and some others came in and funded it. But no, it's true. The legislators don't like these things. And so they have made it more and more difficult to place them on the ballot. And the result is that they have moved further away from maybe the spirit of the initiative process in the first place by making them these big financial propositions. But that's by design. The legislators do not want the citizens to pass laws, period.
Okay, well, thank you for that. All right, I see some Christmas reading proposals in the chat. There's a lot of interesting links in the chat. We're gonna see if we can put those up on the website or on the YouTube page where we will post this panel. So all that's left now is to thank all of you for your active participation, for joining. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. I think we had an incredibly interesting 2 hours, and I wish we had more time to talk about all of this. But we had some great insights. So thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody who joined us, and thank you to Dane, who had to leave but who moderated the first panel. Have a nice rest of the day. Have a nice evening, and join us in the future.
Thank you.
You bet. Right. Thank you very much.